historical background, terminology, and technique. But this is the second of 6 sessions. As I said before in the first lecture, this is a course designed mostly for students and scholars who are already familiar with Pali and the Pali literature, the Pali language, even the Pali grammar, the modern grammar, but they are not familiar with the traditional techniques or the classical techniques of Indian grammar. And last day, if you remember, we saw a little bit what the materials that I have uploaded on Google Drive. I forgot to mention one publication that I would like to simply mention now, is this one. It's a book by Professor Mahesh Deokar from the University of Pune. The book is called Technical Terms and Technique of the Pali and the Sanskrit Grammars. So this is a really good reference work that I use all the time. I think we all should use this book if we are working on Pali grammars or even Sanskrit grammars, on Indian systems of grammar. It's published by the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies in Sarnath in Varanasi. As you can see, it's from 2008. And I was hesitating to share it on Google Drive. As you can see, I do have we have hard copies in our library at SSVU. We have soft copies, but I prefer not to share it on Google Drive. If anyone is interested, please let me know. The book, as far as I know, is no longer available for purchase, so it's out of the market, and I think it's difficult to find it in libraries. So if you need it, please contact me. You can see my email here, and when we can discuss it. So now, without further ado, we will start this second session. So today, what we are going to see a little bit what we have done in the first session last week to refresh a little bit our memory first. Next, point 2, a note on the declension of sannyas, technical terms. As you can see, things are getting a little bit technical already, literally technical. But this note is simply an introduction to point 3, the third topic of today, which is the most important one. That's the thing that I would like you to get home, to take home. That's how does a Vidhi operation rule work? And we are going to see 2 main types of Vidhi rule, that means operation rule. Some of these rules are called Paccaya. Paccaya literally means an affix, but we call these rules also Paccaya rules, that means affixation rules. And another type of Vidhi rule is Adesa, that means replacement. In Sanskrit, it's called Adesha. That's the second type that is also very important for the understanding of Vidhi or operation rules. And then we will also see what the modulators are, and that will be all for today. I hope it will not be too much. I think the lecture of today is a little bit shorter than last day, but definitely more technical. So please bear with me. Hopefully after today's session, things will go downhill. If you understand this session, the rest will be, I hope, pretty clear. So we start with a recap of lesson 1, what we saw last week. The main point that I would like to convey from last week is that the Kaccāyana grammar that we are studying here uses materials from the Sanskrit tradition. So there is no prior Pali tradition before the Kaccāyana, or if there was any, it disappeared. We don't have any extant document. The Kaccāyana is the oldest Pali grammar that we have. And it takes materials from the Pratishakya treatises on Vedic phonetics. It takes materials from Panini's Ashtadhyayi, the famous grammar of Panini, the classical Sanskrit grammar of Panini. It also takes many materials, and indeed it more or less mimics the structure of the Katantra grammar of Sharvavarman, composed around the 2nd century Common Era. And most probably there are other sources that we don't know, from which the author or authors of the Kaccāyana took materials from. And as you can see, this symbol of recycling is intended as a representation of the fact that the Kaccāyana in some ways takes materials or takes the DNA material from the older grammars, but it's rearranged, recomposed in such a way that instead of explaining how Sanskrit works, obviously the Kaccāyana explains how Pali works. So although the DNA is practically the same, the final result, the final organism that we have is not so similar. Then perhaps the most important topic that we covered last week are the four main types of rules. There are two other types, but they are minor. You just have to remember these four first. The Sanya rules or suttas, they give the definitions of technical terms. A Sanya is basically a name or a technical name that will be used in the grammar. Then we have Adhikara rules, Adhikara suttas. These rules give us a domain, or they open a domain within which certain rules will operate. So Adhikara means a governing rule. It's a rule that dominates the rules that come afterwards, or sometimes the rules that are prior to this rule. So it opens a specific domain for certain operations. Then another type of rule is the paribhasa rule, in Sanskrit paribhasha. As the name already suggests, it's about the bhasha, so it's a meta-linguistic rule. In this case, it's a meta rule. It's a meta-grammatical rule, really. It's a rule about how the grammar works. And we will see one important paribhasa today, so you will hopefully understand clearly what the meaning of paribhasa is. So these three types, we call them ancillary rules or secondary rules, or rules that are subservient to the main types of rules, the rules proper, the commands that prescribe operations that are called vidhi operation. So this is what we saw last week. And this is what today we are going to see a little bit more how these different types of rules are combined. But specifically, we want to see how the vidhi operation rule is structured. But before we see that, it is important to give a short note on the declension of sanyas, technical terms. That is to say, how these technical terms that are artificial are used within the grammar as if they were normal words. And of course, in the normal Pali language, you can decline any word. When it is a subject, it's in the nominative. When it's an object, it's in the accusative. So similarly, these technical terms are not dead, so to say, are not frozen. They are used as any other word and they are declined. But there are some specific issues with the grammar as a metalinguistic tool that we need to take into account. And they are discussed or described or presented in a very short statement from Panini. That's Panini 1.168. This is a Paribhasha Sutra from Panini that applies to the Kaccāyana and applies to basically any grammatical system from India. And the rule says, Swam Rupam Shabdasya Ashabda Samnya. And that means something like, in my translation, a word represents its own form, except when this word is a technical term. Now, it might look a little bit complicated if you see it just from this slide, but let's suppose a real rule from the Kaccāyana, Kaccāyana 73. It says Gava se. The meaning of this rule is very simple. It just means that the word go before sa, and sa is the ending of the genitive or dative, before sa becomes gava. So you don't say gosa, you say gavasa. That means of the cow. The word gava or go means cow. But when we are reading a grammar, we may have a doubt here, because if the grammarian is using the word gava, we do not know whether he refers to a real cow. So does it mean that we have to apply the genitive case ending to a cow? And that would be very difficult. Or does it mean that we have to apply the genitive case ending to the form, to the own form of the word, that is the sound, the sequence of sounds, g, a, v, a. So here clearly in the grammar, the shabda, the word, represents its own form. It does not represent the external referent, right? That is quite clear. But there is an exception, and that is except when this word is a technical term. So we have already seen what technical terms are, otherwise known as sanyas. And one that we have already seen is ja. So ja doesn't mean anything in Pali except for the syllable ja, the sound ja. But in the grammar, it's a rulhi sanya, that is an artificial technical term that refers to a reality, so an external reality, so to say, that is the masculine and neuter ending in e or e. So when the word ja is used in the grammar, it could refer to two things. It could refer to its own form, ja, that it's its own sound, or it could refer to its object, to its referent. So in this case, unlike the case of the cow, it does not refer to itself, it refers to some reality. In this case, the reality has already been described, and it's the EE endings. And because it's used as a normal word, it is also declined. So in the grammar, you will see it actually declined. You will never find the word ja. You will always find it in decline in some case ending. For instance, you can find it in the nominative, jo. In that case, most probably, it will indicate the replacement, that thing which has to replace some other thing. Or you can find it in the accusative, and that would mean the substitute also, the replacement. Sorry, there is a mistake here, I think. In the case of accusative, it's usually, in that case, it's 100%, it will be the replacement. In the case of nominative, there are other possibilities, but that's beside the point here. What is important is that you will see it declined in some ways. The word ja will be used as any other word. You can also find it in ablative, for instance, jamha or jato, which would mean after ee, or you can find jassa, which would mean instead of ee, or you can find it in the locative, jasmim, which would mean something like before ee in the grammar. Now that we know this, how the technical terms are used as normal words, and how normal words are used as simply referring to their own shape, their own sounds, we can move to the third point, most important point for today. So how does a vidhi operation rule work? We are going to see, as we said at the beginning, two main types of vidhi. If you understand these two types, I believe you understand practically all the vidhis that you will encounter. Of course, there are always exceptions, but you will be quite safe. We will start with vidhi pachaya affixation vidhis. That means these are operations that prescribe that some affix, some item is added, is affixated to a base. The normal state of affairs here would be that you have two items, one item on the left, and then the main item that we call A. So the item on the left will express something like after X, so after this item, and the item called A is the affix, that is that which is going to be inserted. As to the item on the left, this can be only of two types. It can be a linga, that is a nominal base, or it can be a dhatu, that is a verbal base. It cannot be any other type. Of course, the dhatus are not directly used, so they need to be processed, but basically these are the two types. Now, to recognize the item on the left, you will see it because it is used in the ablative, and the item on the right is used in the nominative. Now, let's see, for instance, the rule tato cha vipattiyo. Here we see the word tato, which is in the ablative, and we see the word vipattiyo, which is in the nominative. That means after the nominal base, the case endings, vipattis, are inserted. So here, tato actually means lingato. After the linga, we know that from the context. And vipattiyo here is a nominative plural. And so you know from the previous rule that the ablative expresses the left context. That means after something. And the right represents the item that is going to be inserted. So here, tato means after that. We can obviate the cha. And vipattiyo is a nominative plural. I'm already giving this information. And that means that after that, the case endings are added. So far, we cannot understand much from this rule, but that's what we would get. We need other rules to intervene in order to go on with the operation. After Kaccāyana 54, we have Kaccāyana 55, which give us the vipattis. That is siyo, amyo, nahi, sanam, smahi, sanam, smim, sum. So it might not be directly obvious what this means, but because we have already mentioned the name vipatti before, the vipattiyo, the vipattis, what comes next is nothing but the definition or the representation of what these vipattis are. And they are siyo, that means nominative, singular, and plural. Amyo, accusative, singular, and plural. nahi, instrumental, singular, and plural, and so on. So you have a set of 7 couplets, 7 pairs, and they represent the vibhattis. Now, one interesting thing about the Kaccāyana grammar is that these vibhattis are taken as one single set that will apply to any nominal stem. We have said that affixes or pacchayas are added to verbal bases or nominal bases. So in this case, the vibhattis are one type of pacchaya. There are other types. We are looking here at one example. The vibhattis are one type of pacchaya that is added to nominal bases. But to any nominal base, you will start by adding this set of pacchayas that are the vibhattis. So whether it is a stem ending in a, like Buddha, or a masculine stem or base ending in I or U or A, I, U, etc., you will always begin by adding any of these vibhattis. Of course, you probably have never seen the word Buddha si, so the nominative of the word Buddha is not Buddha plus si. That would not be the nominative singular. There are other operations that take place afterwards. So that is not the end of the story, but it should be the beginning of the story. So you always begin with this. What you achieve with this is that instead of having needing a complete list of paradigms, that is usually what you will find in a modern grammar, printed grammar, where you will see different paradigms. Actually, there are many. In traditional grammar, you always start from any base, and then there are a certain group of affixes, in this case the 14 vibhattis, and these vibhattis will be replaced if necessary in order to achieve the final form that is called the rupa siddhi. You can see that in the traditional terminology. Rupa siddhi is a compound that it doesn't really mean the final form, it means the completion of the form. So the aim of all this process of derivation. So this is what you find in the grammar, in the reference grammars like Geiger and so on, or other grammars of the Pali that you might be using. So it occupies a lot of space, but in traditional grammar, you start always with a single set, and that in many ways makes things easier, because then you will only replace these items when necessary, and if not, then you don't need to do anything else. And we have been mentioning the adesa, the replacement, because that's something that usually happens after the pacchaya, that means affixation, and we are going to see now how this works. This is a little bit, perhaps a little bit more complicated than the simple affixation. Affixation or pacchaya simply means adding one item to another item. So you express the left context with an ablative, and after that you express something with the nominative, that thing will be added. For the adesa, there are different subtypes, you could say, or at least I'm including all these subtypes in the category of adesa. Although there is adesa properly speaking, that means a replacement. One item is replaced with another item. But there's another type called lopa that literally means elision, that means deleting something. But this can also be counted as an adesa, because what you are really doing in grammar is replacing something with zero, with nothing. But this nothing is something. It's like a zero in mathematics. It's something. It is there, occupies a position as zero value. Then there is another type of operation called agama that literally means insertion. For instance, you have seen that in the aorist tense in Pali, sometimes there is an agama of a before the verb. So akasi, instead of saying kasi, he did, you say akasi, he did. So this at the beginning is one of the agamas. It's inserted. Here again, you could say that there is the replacement of that something replaces zero. There was zero before, if you want to understand in this way, and it's replaced with something. And viparinama is a modification, which in many ways is also replacing one form with another. Viparita, again, is metathesis, that means reciprocal replacement. So the usual state of affairs here with the replacement is the following one. You will have, again, a certain context to the left and to the right, and then there's going to be an operation in the middle. And when I say in the middle, usually it's literally in the middle. The way the rule is formulated is more or less like this. Not always, but in theory it's like this. So you find that there is one part that is simply the context. The context is very important because it's giving us obviously the context when certain operations may happen, whether it's mandatory or optional, that is expressed by other items. But we need to see the context, whether the context is the right one, and then the operation happens. So this operation is in the middle. And how we understand this rule, this formulation is as follows. The left context will tell us that after X item, A is replaced with B. And the right context will tell us before Y, so before another item. This right context is very important here, is expressed in the locative, as you can see. And sometimes this locative or sattami is called the nimitta sattami, because it's a very important condition for the operation to take place. The code here of case endings used in a technical manner is the following. The left context, again, because that's where you are coming from. So it's after something coming from that item. It's expressed in the ablative after X. The genitive conventionally expresses the item that is going to be replaced. So when you see a genitive, so if you would see jassa, that would mean instead of E and E. You know that ja means E or E. So jassa would mean instead of. And then you will find a word in the nominative. Whether the word is explicit or implicit, that is irrelevant here. It should be there somehow, whether it's visible or invisible, it is there. And it's in the nominative, and that expresses the item that is going to replace the previous item. And finally, as I said, there is the locative that expresses the right context, the context to the right. Not right in the sense of correct, but right in as opposed to left. Yeah. Now, there are some cases in the Kaccāyana where it follows a different system, which boils down to the same thing. But you could also use nominative and nominative for A becomes B. That will be the meaning. That's why it's a nominative and a nominative. The order of the words will tell us which is which. So the first one becomes the second one. Or you can even find A adopts the form of B. So A takes B. That's why the first one is expressed in the nominative, the second one in the accusative. I know that some of you might think, well, this grammar that was supposed to be so technical and so precise is not so precise after all. And I think you are correct. But usually the context in the Kaccāyana will inform us. And more than the context, or at least it will be the context that the vutti, the commentary, will make explicit. But that is something that today we are not going to touch. We are going to begin with the vutti next week. So basically, for any operation of replacement, and these replacements are very common, they take place all the time in the grammar. This is what you have. You have a context, left and right. So the left one is expressed in the ablative. It means after something. Right one in the locative. It means before that item. And then in the middle, you have a replacement. The idea is very simple. You replace this with that. So for instance, before we were discussing about the word Buddha. So how do you get the nominative singular? First, you take the nominal stem, Buddha. Then you add the first case ending that in the list is si. So you will have Buddha si. But then there will be another rule, which is also very short. It's simply called so. That means si, o. That will be this type. Si becomes o. So si becomes o. And then instead of Buddha si, you have Buddho. There is a deletion of the final vowel of the stem in Buddha. So that's another replacement, etc. So it's not so difficult if you remember, especially if you remember what is the meaning, the technical meaning of the use of the case endings. And you remember that the technical terms, the sannyas, will be used as normal words and will be declined. So as we said before, if you want to say instead of EE, you don't express it in this way. You simply say jassa. So you use the technical term ja in the genitive. Now, before we end, we are going to see some examples. The first example includes affixation and replacement. It's Kaccāyana 103, to nena. So I think unless you are familiar with the grammar, this doesn't mean anything. But perhaps some of you already recognize that ena looks very much like the ending of an instrumental singular, and then you will be right. Na, you can see the way I have edited it, you can see that there is something missing. So indeed, this something missing is na, which is the default vibhatti for instrumental singular. And then what happens with ato, that's nothing but the ablative of a. So a is the sound a. It has been defined at the beginning of the grammar as one of the sounds. So these are all technical terms. Every sound of the alphabet, so to say, is a term that is used in grammar. So you can make the genitive of a, you can make the ablative of a. So the ablative of a is ato. Now you know that the ablative means after. So here would mean after a, na, that is in the nominative, that as it is, ena. So basically what that means is after a, na becomes ena. Why is it useful? This replacement is useful because, again, if you want to make the instrumental singular of Buddha, you cannot say Buddha na. You start with attaching the pacchaya, the vibhatti na, to the nominal stem Buddha, but then you replace this na with ena, and you get the final result, Buddhena. Here, as you can see, I'm skipping one step, which is the deletion of the final a of Buddha, but you can already guess that there is another rule for this replacement, or this lopa rather. So here, as I said, what happens is the following. You start with the base, then you have to take the vibhatti, the affix, and then there is a rule for replacement, and then you reach the final form. Second example. Jalanam iuva sare va. This is a longer rule, perhaps a little bit more complicated to understand. If we just look at it immediately, perhaps you understand the meaning of va, which means or. Sare, so sara means vowel. And then jala is a technical term that we saw last day. And it's a compound, a dvandva. It includes ja and la. So it means ja and la. So if you make the compound, it will be jala. And the nominative plural would be jala. And the genitive plural is jalanam. So jalanam is actually a genitive plural of this dvandva compound. That means ii and uu, or e and u or u endings. So that's in the genitive. Then you have the word iuva. There is an internal sandhi here. You have to understand ia and uva, also a dvandva. Ia and uva, it's a nominative plural. Iuva, ia uva, it's a nominative plural. Sare is from sara, that means vowel. That's another technical term that has been defined at the beginning of the grammar. And finally, you have an option marker. That's a marker or modulator that we will explain in the next lessons. So here, if we start translating with decoding it according to what we have seen before, we have a locative that is a right context to the right, and we have to translate it as before this item, so before a vowel, ia and uva, and we understand these are the replacements for, or they replace ii and uu respectively. So this respectively is a yatasankyam. That means according to the sequence. There is a paribhasa rule in the Sanskrit grammar that is telling us that when there are these replacements of series or sequences of items, usually it's 2 and 2 or 3 and 3. So you have to replace them according to the same sequence. So what you understand here is that before a vowel, ia will be replaced. Ia will replace i or i, and uva will replace u or u. So the final meaning of the sutta, in my provisional translation, I think it more or less makes sense, would be optionally. Optionally stands for va, means or. So optionally, before a vowel, ia replaces i or i, and uva replaces u or u. Examples. That's the examples that are given in the Kaccāyana vutti. As you can see, they are a little bit problematic, but we are not going into this now. From agyagare, where you only have an i that has become ia because of another rule of replacement, you find agyagare with the ia replacement. And instead of bhikkhvasane or bhikkhu asane, you find bhikkhuvasane. We will discuss this type of options in the next sessions. I'm not going to go into the details here. There are some problems with the examples as I have presented them, but you can see that at least the possible option agyagare and bhikkhu vasane are replacements that are prescribed by this rule that is optional. So many times we will find vidhi rules that are optional. We are going to discuss that in future sessions too. And finally, another example that you can count as a type of replacement, but it's simply a lopa. It's the elision of something, is the deletion of something. And that's in a very simple rule. We will end with this simple rule for you to see that actually the Kaccāyana grammar is in many ways very easy and very straightforward once you know a few things. Here you don't have, well, you have basically the essential items that you need for an operation. Sara, sare, lopam. You already know the meaning of sara. It means vowel. Sare is in the locative, and sara is in the nominative. Of course, the nominative plural, because otherwise would be saro. So that would mean something like vowels before a vowel, lopam, and lopam is in the accusative. We have seen that sometimes the replacement can be expressed by nominative takes accusative. So sara, the vowels take lopa. They become elision. They become zero. So if we follow the scheme or the structure of the replacement, here we don't have the left context. That is irrelevant in this case. We don't always need it. So we start with sara in the nominative. Sare, right context, before vowel, they adopt the form of lopa, elision. So sara, sare, lopam, vowels before a vowel, adopt elision. It is a very literal translation, but I think it more or less conveys the sense. What we get here, simply as an example, this is a very normal case of sandhi where there is the elision of the previous vowel, is that in the case of tena upasankami, you get ten upasankami. So the vowel a before the vowel u has attained the state of lopa, the state of nothingness. Sorry. Now, to conclude, I would like to introduce some items that I call modulators because they are not intrinsic part of the operation, but they are necessary. They are not necessary, but they very often appear and they influence the way we understand the operation. So if the operation more or less takes this form, then we very often have what are called markers. For instance, cha, api, va, kwachi, na, nicham, and others. These words are regular words, regular conjunctions or indeclinables. I think you already know the meaning. Cha means and, api means also, va means or, kwachi means in some places, na means no or not, nicham means always or mandatorily. But in grammar, they adopt a technical meaning or rather a technical function. They are marking, they are used as marks, and they are very important. Without them, the grammar would not work. You remember from the first lesson that the grammar is very short. That it's very short because in most of the rules or suttas, there is information that is implied. So you need to retrieve this information from previous rules. And in order to retrieve this information or how to retrieve it, you need markers. They are very important. Another item that may or may not appear, but it does appear very often, is a kind of semantic modulator. That would mean something like you perform this operation if your intention is to express that sense or that nuance of the meaning of the word. So there are certain words that maybe they can be used in a normal way, or they can be used in a derogatory way. For instance, the word wood in Pali, you can simply cut the wood. That's not important, but I consider you a piece of wood or a log. That is derogative. So that would be a case. Well, if you want to express a derogatory sense, then do this or do that. So this I call a semantic modulator, and it is expressed in the locative. It could be potentially confused with the other locative, the right context, but generally you will see that it is not. And if there is ambiguity, the vutti or the commentary will clarify things. So as I say, I call these two items modulators, and they are also important in the functioning of vidhi rules. So to conclude, the summary of what we have seen today. Most vidhi or operational rules teach paccaya, affixation, or adesa, replacement, using previous definitions, sannyas. It is all about adding particles to a base and then replacing them if or when needed. To understand vidhis, we should keep in mind the following code of case endings. And very simplified, this is the ablative will mean after X. The genitive will mean instead of X. Nominative will mean simply X, that is the replacement. The locative, the first type of locative, right context means before X. And the second type of locative that we have seen as a modulator would mean in the sense of X. And that's all. Thank you very much. That's all for today. We will continue in the next session. And in the next session, we will already introduce the vutti. That is very important and part of the Kaccāyana system. Thank you. If there are any questions now, I think we have 20 minutes for discussion.
Thank you, Aleix, very much. That was really clear. May I ask a question about Sunday, if you can hear me okay?
Sure.
Okay. So I'm just curious about how the Sunday works in the grammar. So you had the example there of na, the instrumental ending, and I think, and it was the sun, yeah. So, and it was ato nena. So does the Sunday that applies in real Pali, as it were, always apply in the grammar? Because earlier on, you also had the list of vibhatti, the list of case endings, yes. And there it didn't seem to apply, unless I've misunderstood. So could you say a bit about Sunday within the grammar?
Yeah. So like here, in theory, Sunday applies in the language of the grammarians as it applies in normal language. So the normal state of affairs is that there will be Sunday. The same Sunday that is taught in the first book of the Kaccāyana applies to the grammar itself. So in the rules, you will find Sunday like in ato nena. So instead of ato na ena. So there is the lopa of the previous vowel. And that is the normal state of affairs. But sometimes, I think for the sake of clarity, especially when you are giving lists of technical terms, these general rules of Sandhi are overwritten or overlooked, like in this case, because what I understand is that here, after every item, there is a pause, or there should be a pause. Or at least after each pair, there should be a pause. Although I have a comma, but I guess in manuscripts, you could add a double danda or something like that. So in this case, like for instance, see yo between yo and the o is not elided; it remains. And I understand that this is the reason. It's a technical reason. And here I would think that that's because there is a pause. Otherwise, there should be Sandhi.
Great, thank you very much for clarifying that. So the na is, you really only understand it if you've been taught it, or if you've got the commentary, presumably the na that becomes ato nena. Yeah.
Yes, usually the vutti will clarify these things, and that is what we are going to see from next day. We'll see how the vutti is essential to simply clarify and make clear what the actual wording of the sutta is. But once you have studied the vutti, then you can go back to the sutta, and if you remember ato nena, you already know that this is na. You don't need to remember the entire vutti. You can somehow reproduce it mentally.
Great, thanks. So my other question is just a bit of guidance. So as I'm listening to you, for me, it's very clear, but it's partly refreshing things I know about Panini already.
Yes.
So if people haven't studied Panini or Kaccāyana and are coming to this for the first time, obviously they can go through your slides again and the recording. But have you any other advice about how to make it less alien, as it were?
I'm not so sure. The first thing, I guess, is why would someone study or want to study the Kaccāyana grammar or a classical grammar? Although I'm studying these texts, I'm of the opinion that they are not really necessary. If what you want is to read the Pali, the Tipitaka, and even if you want to read commentaries, for most of the commentarial literature, it is not necessary. And then it is possible that if you would spend your life studying Pali only using modern grammars, you would reach a point of expertise from which studying a classical grammar would be much, much easier, because you will understand more things, you will understand the commentaries on these grammars, so you can basically study it on your own. But for someone who is particularly interested in the traditional system, I would simply use the textbooks or the translations, for instance, Utitana's book. And if possible, I know that this is not always possible, but to take a course with a teacher. Self-study is more complicated, but if you have a teacher and then you can discuss and you can ask questions, that makes things always easier. I think in general, the system of classical Indian grammars is outdated because we do not memorize. I would say that. In that sense, we are really studying a kind of oral grammar, but as if it were a written text.
Are there any good recordings? So I remember learning Panini off by heart, and of course one learnt with the teacher and one got the cadence and everything that helped make it easy to remember. Are there good recordings of Kaccāyana that you could point us to if we wanted to do that learning by heart that makes it easier to bring in the rules at the right point?
That's a very good question, and that's something I'm also interested in, but I don't have an answer. I don't know. I have never heard any or listened to any recording of the Kaccāyana. I have seen novices reciting it, but in a very almost informal way when they were studying for themselves. And that is something that I would also be interested in having a recording of the full Kaccāyana recited. I have never heard it, so I have never found anyone who can recite it from the beginning to the end. But right. I'm sure that there are many scholars who can do it.
So if anybody knows anyone who can, maybe we can get a recording.
Yes.
That's my questions. Thank you. I'll let other people talk now. Tony has a question. Oh, Tony, there you go.
Yes. Thank you again. Very clear, but it is getting a little bit more difficult. One of the questions I have a question and a comment. The role of semantics in this, because you call you use the term semantic modulators, and then you mentioned at the beginning the idea of how can you tell whether it's referring to the cow or it's referring to this kind of rule that has a second technical meaning. And I'm wondering, at what point do you really ever need to know what the words mean semantically? Like you also referenced sometimes it refers to the external world, sometimes it's its own artificial poly world, but it seems to me from what you laid out that you never really need to refer to the external world. Or, I mean, I hope, maybe I'm wrong, but I was hoping you could maybe clarify that.
Yeah, in general, so the answer is yeah, that is correct. You don't need to refer to the external world. You are referring to the words, and specifically in the Kaccāyana grammar, you are referring to the words that are found in the Buddha Vachana, in the Tipitaka mostly, also in the commentary. There are some examples taken from commentaries, but we are simply analyzing the shape of the word. But insofar as the semantic element may influence the shape of the word, the morphology, it is important and it is relevant for the grammar and for the derivation process, but only to that extent, because grammar does not teach meaning. The meaning is taught by another auxiliary science, if you wish, which is called nirutti, in Sanskrit nirukta. Obviously, in the Pali tradition, the Neruttikas are the grammarians in general, so they are masters of Vyakarana, which is what we are seeing now, the Kaccāyana Vyakarana, but there's also the science, the linguistic science of Nirutti, that is semantic analysis. So that is a different department, and in that department you do analyze meaning, and specifically meaning, but that is not part of the Vyakarana. And in many commentaries, you will find more Nirutti than Vyakarana. You do find some Vyakarana, but most of the time the Vyakarana is implicit, like in the Buddhaghosa's commentaries. If you know Panini, you can see that he has already taken some rules for granted, and then he's going into the meaning, how words mean what they mean. But as you have rightly observed, grammar is not about meaning.
And thank you for that. That makes it very clear. The other comment I had is that I think when we talk about the kind of importance of learning this grammar for Pali literature, we're talking about a certain kind of Pali literature that's very old. And going to these talks of yours, these classes have made me quite worried about my own translations of a modern commentary, 1948, the Milindapanna Atthakatha, because he directly references these grammars when he's trying to make explanations. And the first time I translated it, I had no idea what the words were. And sometimes you can't find those in a dictionary. So I wonder how important this kind of vocabulary, technical vocabulary, is for when you're looking at texts in Myanmar over the last couple of centuries, as opposed to, you know, our more classical texts that are millennia old.
Then in that case, I would say the opposite of what I said before. If, excuse me, if the goal of a student is to, you know, to go back to the early Buddhist teachings and so on, maybe they don't really need the Kaccāyana. But if someone is interested, as I think we are, in the tradition, and from my point of view, when a tradition begins today, so it's not something that began in the 5th century BC, and then we do all the, you know, we move through all the centuries, but we are always beginning from today. So that's how I understand the practice of history, at least. So only the present time is real. So that's what we have. If you want to understand how even the oldest materials of the Pali canon have arrived to us, you need to understand a little bit about its tradition. How, for instance, even if you're only interested in the philological aspects of the early Pali teachings, you know, everyone knows that we don't have 5th century before Common Era manuscripts. Our manuscripts, as you point out, are quite recent, 2 centuries old, 3 centuries old. They have been copied by scholars or scribes, or edited by scholars who studied the Pali, and they did it through grammars like the Kaccāyana. So in that sense, and I would say roughly after the 14th or 15th century in Southeast Asia, the Kaccāyana and other Pali grammars are very important in the commentarial tradition, in the local commentary or regional commentarial tradition. If you don't have a more or less clear grasp on the Kaccāyana, it doesn't make any sense. And then you think one can easily think that, okay, this is just pure scholastic speculation and so on. But it is important in the way how you create meaning from the original text. And it is one of the more or less objective systems through which I guess everyone can agree. So if you want to agree with another person on the meaning of Nibbana, and you reduce Nibbana to an experience, then it's very difficult to reach an agreement. But if we know that Nibbana is a word also, or is a concept, and it's explained in certain ways, and it is actually constructed with a nominal base and a paccaya and affix, so then we can look at what kind of affix is it, and what does it express, and what does the Kaccāyana say about that. And that's what they do, basically. And so they start with the grammatical analysis, then they move into the semantic analysis, and then probably they do other types of analysis. But they do not forget the grammatical analysis first. That is the most analytic type of analysis. That's a bit redundant, but yeah, that's how it is, because it breaks down the word into pieces. And that has been like this in India, or in intellectual traditions in India for millennia, I think. And the Pali tradition is not an exception. So the answer is, yeah, it's very important. If you are studying a relatively modern commentary written in Pali, they're probably going to refer to Kaccāyana.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I don't want to hog the airwaves, as it were. So anybody else, please butt in. So I just wanted to ask whether you feel that the grammar being later than the Pali, than the canonical text, means that some aspects of the Pali language, the earliest Pali language, get misunderstood by the grammar. So I'm thinking, for example, sort of odd forms of the aorist and things like that, that if you've got a Sanskrit background, you might come in and say, there's a misunderstanding here, that's actually an aorist form that's been lost to the future, or whether you think that actually the Kaccāyana does cope with these kind of very ancient forms or more diverse forms.
I think it doesn't. It cannot cope with all these forms, and I think that was, so we cannot blame the grammarians, because that, I believe it was technically impossible. So the type of historical linguistic analysis that we can carry out today is due to the fact that we have accumulated so much information, and we have so many texts from so many different regions all over the centuries, and we have computers. So we are in a position where it is quite easy to trace back some very rare forms in Pali. So in that case, the Pali grammarians, as well as some commentators like Buddhaghosa, sometimes they are at a loss, and that is quite understandable. I think what is more interesting is to see the bottle half full, so to say, because sometimes they do discuss rare forms, and sometimes these forms, for instance, in the Sattaniti, you find certain verbal forms that are not preserved in our Tipitaka, and then scholars believe that these forms perhaps were in the Buddhist text that Agavamsa was reading in the 12th century. And even if we are interested in a more scientific or modern approach to the grammar of the Tipitaka, the study of the traditional grammarians will help us to understand the process of transmission of the old text. So in that sense, because I'm also interested in the early Buddhist literature, but you cannot obviate, you cannot overlook the tradition of this text. They have been copied and recopied. They have been edited and re-edited. And because the editors were familiar with the grammar, sometimes you can guess why the text has been corrupted, so to say, or a form has been preserved, or the form is understood or misunderstood. But to go back to the question, I think, yeah, from today's point of view, the grammar of Kaccāyana would be insufficient. But that is something that every Buddhist scholar or Theravada scholar who is proficient in grammar would also acknowledge. I don't think anyone who is a great grammarian today in the Theravada world would recommend that you study only the Kaccāyana, or But knowing the Kaccāyana is definitely a requisite for a broad basis or foundation. But we definitely can benefit from modern studies of historical linguistics, and indeed many so-called traditional scholars that I met, some monastic scholars, they do that. They use any type of resource. This is not Buddha Vachana. This is just something that we use in order to access the teachings of the Buddha and the commentators.
Thank you. If there aren't more questions, maybe people can also in the chat just say whether they find the pace right, whether there's anything they want to do.
Yes.
I think for people for whom this is the first time, obviously listening to the recording that will go up on the TNTS website will help. But other than that, just about whether the pace is okay and that kind of thing, people can comment in the chat.
Yes, I would appreciate. I have to say that this is the most technical session of the 6. From next day, we will go more into the reading the text with some examples. We'll go slow, but I think we will be referring back to this session in order to clarify some points or to strengthen the point.
Great, thank you. So for me, this was about the right pace, and the way you gave examples was just exactly what I needed. So if people can say whether that worked for them as well, or whether they'd like something slower or more examples, just say.
Otherwise, you have my email in the first slide. You can, if you don't want to comment now, you can comment in private. You can send me an email with feedback, and I will really appreciate. This is the first time that I'm teaching this type of seminar, and I guess also being online makes it a little bit more complicated. But I'm very happy with the fact that so many people joined. So I thank you all very much for your patience and for your willingness to endure this. Thank you.
Great. So Tony's given a little suggestion there that we could take up. That's great. And yeah,
Great.
That's really good. Thanks. I wish we could have. So sometimes you're saying something which is actually pretty funny about the tradition, and the tradition seems to have had a good sense of humor itself. And you can't see that you're probably making us all nod and smile at that point, or even laugh. So it's great that you're able to carry on so smoothly.
Yeah, well, I try. It's a little bit solipsistic, like it's like you are talking to yourself about things that you already have written, or but yeah. We are all trying to catch up with this new situation.
So there's a question from Adam. Can you see that, Aleix?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Looking quickly through, I noticed a reference in the text to Upagupta. Any comments on this non-Pali reference? Yeah, my comment is very tentative. There is indeed, there are here and there you find references not simply to specific forms of the language that we are not familiar with, but sometimes to personages, or like in this case, you find references to Upagupta, which is one of the disciples of the Buddha, or one of the traditional teachers of Buddhism, that was, if I'm not wrong, he belonged to the area of Mathura, if I'm not wrong, or the area of Avanti. I'm not so sure about that. But the thing is that you find the reference to Upagupta, which is not found in the Tipitaka, and then one cannot but start wondering about the origin of the Kaccāyana grammar, because, of course, the question might be why was Buddhaghosa using Sanskrit grammar, and why was Pali grammar so late? Is it the case perhaps that this grammar was circulating in other communities of Buddhists, even Theravada Buddhists or something similar to Theravada Buddhists? We don't really know what's the origin of the Kaccāyana. That's one of the mysteries. But from these references, like to Upagupta, it could be that the Kaccāyana was originally Pali grammar composed in a place where the Sarvastivada tradition was more prominent. We don't know. Or maybe it was a kind of Pali version of some other Sarvastivadin Sanskrit grammar, or Buddhist Sanskrit grammar. We don't know. But that's very interesting also for the history of Buddhism, to see that some of the texts that are now classical in the Theravada tradition, and to the point that they are more or less orthodox, you will find them in every library. Originally, we don't really know where they come from, and they seem to come from communities outside of what we call today the Theravada community of the Mahavihara and so on. Well, I cannot tell more about that, but simply that Adam is totally correct, and he has observed a very good point. And well, I would simply encourage Adam to do more research on that. I think that in John Strong's book there is some reference to it. Olepind also refers to it in some article, but I cannot tell more. It just seems that like in other passages of the Pali grammatical literature, it seems that there is some influence from Mula Sarvastivadin or Sarvastivadin texts, but I cannot say more. I don't know more than that. Sorry.
Great, thank you, Aleix, so much again for a really great class. We come to the end of the time now, so I guess we all wave goodbye and say thank you. And,
thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Look forward to next week. Maybe P and